I'm 79. I'm talking to you like this because I don't have the luxury of waiting anymore. I can feel the edges of my days now, not in a dramatic way, just in how quickly the mornings arrive and how easily the nights slip past. I wouldn't be saying this if time still felt generous. It doesn't. And that's why I need to say it plainly. The lie I believed was simple, almost respectable. I told myself there would be a right time, a better time, a calmer season, a moment when things would finally line up and allow me to do what I kept postponing. Say what mattered. Change what wasn't working. At the time, it didn't feel like a lie at all. It felt like maturity. It felt like being careful. People around me spoke the same way. You wait until the kids are older. You wait until the finances are stable. You wait until work settles down. You wait until you're less tired, less stressed, less needed by everyone else. Waiting was framed as wisdom. Acting too soon was called impulsive. I absorbed that without question. I wasn't lazy or reckless. That's important to say. I showed up. I paid my bills. I kept my promises. I carried responsibilities that other people relied on. When something felt uncomfortable, when a conversation felt risky, when a decision threatened the balance of things, I told myself it wasn't the right moment. Not now. Later, when things are clearer, and people rewarded that behavior. They called me patient, sensible, steady. I was praised for not rushing into things, for being level-headed, for keeping things together. No one ever pulled me aside and said, "Be careful. You might be waiting your life away." Because from the outside, it looked like I was doing everything right. What I didn't realize was that the right time was never something real. It wasn't a date on the calendar. It wasn't a condition that would eventually be met. It was just a way to delay discomfort, a way to avoid the risk of change, a way to keep moving forward without actually choosing anything. Every time I felt the urge to speak honestly, I postponed it. I told myself the other person wasn't ready. Or I wasn't. Every time I felt unhappy with the direction things were going, I reassured myself that it was temporary, that things would improve on their own. Every time I sensed that a part of me was being neglected, I promised I'd come back to it later. Later became a habit. The danger wasn't that I made one big mistake. It was that I kept making small, reasonable decisions that all leaned in the same direction. Toward delay, toward silence, toward comfort. Each choice felt harmless on its own. Together they quietly shaped a life where nothing urgent ever happened. I didn't wake up one day and decide to disappear. I just kept waiting for permission to fully live. Permission from circumstances, from other people, from an imaginary future version of myself who would somehow be more confident, more secure, more certain. I believed that clarity came before action, that once things felt stable enough, I would finally speak, finally move, finally change. I didn't understand that clarity often comes after you act, not before. By the time I realized this, I had already trained myself to hesitate. Waiting also gave me cover. If I didn't act, I couldn't fail. If I didn't say the difficult thing, I couldn't be rejected. If I didn't choose, I couldn't choose wrong. Waiting felt safe. It felt controlled. It felt like keeping options open, when in reality, options were quietly closing. What no one tells you is that waiting doesn't freeze life in place. While you're waiting for the right time, other people are making decisions without you. Relationships are changing. Opportunities are passing. Your own tolerance for risk is shrinking. You get used to postponing, and it becomes harder to imagine doing anything else. I thought I was being careful with my life. I was actually being careless with time. The most painful part is how invisible it all was while it was happening. There was no alarm, no warning sign, no moment where someone said, "This is it. If you don't act now, you never will." The days just kept stacking up, one responsible decision after another, one delay justified by another delay. Looking back, I can see how often I confused patience with fear, how often I called avoidance being realistic, how often I told myself I was protecting others when I was really protecting myself from discomfort. Waiting felt harmless. It felt neutral. It wasn't. Waiting slowly taught me how to shrink my own needs, how to lower my expectations, how to accept things I should have questioned. Over time, I didn't just wait for the right time. I forgot what I was waiting for. No one warned me that waiting can quietly become a way of disappearing. By the time you notice, it's already been happening for years. Most of my life ran on routine. That's the only honest way to describe it. Not chaos, not misery, routine. The kind that looks stable from the outside and feels manageable from the inside. I woke up at roughly the same time every day, got dressed without thinking about it, went to work, did what was required, came home tired, ate, slept, repeated it again the next day. There was always something that needed attention, deadlines, meetings, chores, family obligations. I stayed busy enough to feel useful and important, which mattered to me more than I admitted. Being needed gave structure to my days. It also gave me an excuse not to look too closely at how I felt. When you're constantly occupied, there's very little silence, and silence is where questions tend to surface. Years passed like this without any clear marker between them. One job blended into another. One phase of life quietly replaced the last. I watched my reflection change without really noticing when it happened. I measured time by responsibilities instead of moments, by what needed to be done next, not by what I was actually experiencing. I played my roles well: employee, partner, parent, friend. I knew what was expected of me in each one, and I met those expectations. I showed up to events. I said the appropriate things. I kept conversations practical, safe, surface level. I avoided topics that might open something I didn't have the energy to deal with. If something felt uncomfortable, I postponed it. There was always a reason. At work, I told myself I was building security. I worked late because it felt responsible, because people depended on me, because saying no felt selfish. Over time, work became a shield. It gave me a reason to avoid difficult conversations at home, a reason to miss dinners, a reason to stay tired enough not to feel much of anything. At home, I told myself things were fine, not good, not bad, fine. That word did a lot of work for me. It allowed me to avoid asking harder questions. It allowed me to accept distance as normal, silence as peace, routine as stability. I convinced myself that wanting more was unrealistic, maybe even ungrateful. Days turned into years without any dramatic collapse. That's the part people don't talk about. Life doesn't always fall apart when you're on autopilot. It just quietly passes. You mark time with birthdays and holidays, but they start to feel repetitive, familiar, predictable. You stop expecting anything different. I remember sitting in traffic most mornings, following the same route, listening to the same kind of news, thinking about the same problems. I don't remember many details beyond that. Whole stretches of my life feel blurred now. Not because they were painful, but because they were empty of awareness. I told myself this was adulthood, that this was what it meant to be mature, to push through, to handle things, to not complain. Everyone else seemed to be doing the same. We compared schedules, not feelings. We talked about work, not doubt. Fatigue became a badge of honor. I didn't hate my life. That's important to say. I just wasn't fully present in it. I moved through my days reacting instead of choosing, responding instead of deciding. I let momentum carry me because stopping felt risky. Slowing down felt dangerous. If I slowed down, I might notice things I didn't want to face. Autopilot doesn't feel like neglect while you're in it. It feels efficient, productive, sensible. You tell yourself you'll reflect later, when things calm down, when you have space. But the truth is, routine has a way of expanding. It fills whatever space you give it. Before I knew it, decades had passed, not stolen, not taken from me, just lived without much attention. And attention, it turns out, is what makes a life feel like it's actually yours. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive the way people imagine these things do. There was no build-up, no sense that something important was about to happen. It was an ordinary day, and that's what made it so unsettling afterward. I was at home. Nothing special about the afternoon. I remember the light coming in through the window, the kind of light you don't think twice about because you've seen it 1,000 times before. The phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was tired and assumed it could wait. I'm still aware of that hesitation. It lasted only a second, but it stays with me now. The voice on the other end was calm, careful. That kind of careful people use when they're carrying news they don't want to deliver. They told me someone I loved had died, someone I had known for most of my life, someone I had been meaning to see. Not urgently, just soon, when things eased up, when I had a bit more time. I didn't react the way I thought I would. I didn't cry right away. I didn't say much at all. I stood there holding the phone, listening, nodding, saying I understood even though I didn't fully. When the call ended, I stayed where I was. I didn't sit down. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the wall in front of me. What struck me wasn't the loss itself. That came later. What hit me immediately was the finality of something I had treated as flexible. I had assumed there would always be another chance to visit, another call, another conversation where I could take my time and be fully present. I had treated that time as if it were stored somewhere, waiting for me. In that moment, I realized it wasn't waiting. It was gone. I thought about the last time we spoke. It wasn't meaningful. It wasn't terrible either. It was ordinary. We talked about practical things. I told myself I'd call back when I wasn't distracted. I never did. There was no argument, no unresolved conflict, just distance created by delay. I remember walking into the kitchen afterward and noticing small details that felt suddenly out of place. A cup on the counter, a chair slightly pulled out. Everything was exactly as it had been before the phone rang, and yet none of it felt the same. That contrast stayed with me. The world hadn't stopped, only my assumptions had. In the days that followed, people said the usual things. They meant well. I nodded and thanked them, but none of their words addressed what I was actually facing. I wasn't just grieving a person. I was grieving all the moments I had assumed were still available to me. That realization was quiet, but it was heavy. It didn't push me to action. It didn't motivate me. It simply removed an illusion I had been living with for decades. The idea that time waits until you're ready. That afternoon made it painfully clear that it doesn't. I had been waiting for the right time, and without warning, The door I assumed would always be open was closed. Not dramatically, permanently. After that, memories didn't come all at once. They arrived slowly, without order. Small moments surfaced when I wasn't expecting them. Not the big milestones people talk about, but ordinary scenes that suddenly felt heavy. I remembered conversations I had rushed because I was tired or distracted. Moments when someone tried to say something important, and I steered the talk back to something practical. I remembered glancing at the clock while someone was speaking, already thinking about what I needed to do next. At the time, it felt harmless, efficient, even. Now it feels different. Invitations came back to me. Not the formal ones, but casual ones. A visit suggested in passing. A coffee that could happen sometime. A short trip I said no to because it wasn't convenient. I told myself I'd make it up later. I didn't think of those moments as choices. I thought of them as postponements. Evenings stand out the most. Times when I stayed late at work because it felt easier than going home and being fully present. Work gave me structure. It gave me a clear role. At home, things were less defined. Emotions didn't come with instructions, so I chose what felt manageable and told myself I was being responsible. I remembered saying the same phrases over and over. Next week. After this deadline. When things slow down, I said them so often they lost meaning. They became automatic responses, not promises. I didn't realize how much weight they carried for the people hearing them. What makes these memories painful isn't that they were dramatic mistakes. It's that they were ordinary. They were moments where I chose comfort, habit, or avoidance without thinking twice. At the time, none of them felt final. They felt adjustable, temporary. There was no signal telling me this was the last chance, no feeling of urgency. That's what makes it hard to accept now. The moments that matter most rarely announce themselves as such. They pass quietly, dressed like any other day. I also remembered the things I didn't say. Gratitude I assumed was obvious. Apologies I planned to offer when the timing felt right. Questions I avoided because I was afraid of the answers. Silence seemed safer than honesty. I told myself I was keeping the peace. Looking back, that silence wasn't neutral. It created distance. It allowed misunderstandings to settle in. It made relationships thinner over time, not broken, just less alive. What I struggle with most is knowing that I was there physically, but often absent in ways that mattered. I showed up to events. I fulfilled obligations. But I wasn't always truly present. My attention was divided. My mind was elsewhere. These memories don't come with drama. They come with a quiet sense of loss, a recognition that so much of what mattered slipped past me while I was busy managing things that felt urgent but weren't permanent. None of those moments can be revisited, not because I didn't care, but because I assumed there would always be another chance. That assumption was wrong. The reckoning didn't come all at once. It wasn't a single night of regret or a sudden emotional collapse. It unfolded slowly, in pieces. As I began to understand what could no longer be recovered, I started noticing how many moments were simply gone. Not misplaced, not delayed, gone. Conversations I would never have, questions I would never get to ask, stories I would never hear in the way they might have been told if I had taken the time to listen earlier. These weren't grand opportunities. They were small openings that had closed quietly. I thought about the times I could have stayed a little longer instead of leaving early. The times I could have listened without trying to fix anything. The moments when someone was reaching out in a way that wasn't obvious, and I missed it because I was focused on my own schedule. At the time, I believed being efficient was a virtue. I see now that efficiency often came at the cost of connection. There were words I never said, simple ones, not dramatic confessions or speeches, just acknowledgments, admissions, gratitude. I assumed people knew how I felt. I assumed there would be time to make it explicit later. That assumption feels careless now. Feelings that remain unspoken don't carry forward on their own. I also recognized how often I chose not to show up fully. I was present in name, but not in attention. I listened with half my mind elsewhere. I responded out of habit rather than care. These moments didn't seem harmful while they were happening, but over time, they shaped the tone of entire relationships. There were chances to change direction that I didn't take, not because I didn't see them, but because they felt inconvenient. A conversation that might have shifted everything if I had been willing to sit in discomfort. A decision that would have required me to admit I was unhappy. I told myself I was being realistic. What I was really doing was protecting myself from uncertainty. I don't regret specific outcomes as much as I regret the pattern. The pattern of choosing what felt easier in the moment over what might have mattered more in the long run. Each choice made sense by itself. Together they formed a life where many important things were left untouched. What's difficult to accept is that no one stopped me. Not because they didn't care, but because from the outside, nothing looked wrong. I met expectations. I followed the rules. I did what was required. Regret didn't come from failure. It came from compliance. There are faces I can still picture clearly. Voices I can still hear if I'm quiet long enough. I remember thinking more than once that I should slow down and be more present. I always told myself I'd do it next time. Next time felt responsible, patient, sensible. Now there is no next time for those moments. They don't exist in the future. They exist only as reminders of what I overlooked while I was busy being careful. This kind of regret doesn't ask for forgiveness. It doesn't look for sympathy. It just sits there, undeniable. A clear accounting of what was available and what I chose instead. I don't punish myself for it. That wouldn't change anything. But I don't excuse it either. I acknowledge it for what it is. A series of ordinary decisions that added up to an irreversible loss. Not of success, not of comfort, of presence. The realization that came afterward wasn't complicated. In fact, that's what made it so difficult to sit with. It wasn't some hidden truth I needed years to uncover. It was something I had brushed past repeatedly because it felt too obvious to take seriously. What actually mattered was never the things I organized my life around. It wasn't the stability I worked so hard to maintain. It wasn't the routines that kept everything predictable. It wasn't the roles I performed well enough to be praised for. Those things filled time, but they didn't give it weight. What mattered was attention, being there without distraction, letting a moment be unfinished and imperfect, sitting with someone without trying to manage the outcome. These were the things I kept postponing because they didn't feel urgent. They didn't come with deadlines or consequences I could immediately see. I spent years sacrificing closeness for control. I chose predictability over honesty because honesty felt risky. I chose order over presence because order made me feel safe. I told myself I was doing this for the sake of others, for stability, for the long term. In reality, I was afraid of what might change if I allowed things to be fully seen. The contrast is hard to ignore now. I gave so much energy to maintaining the structure of my life, and so little to experiencing it. I protected schedules more carefully than people. I defended routines more firmly than relationships. I thought I was being responsible. I see now that I was being selective about what I allowed to matter. There were moments when I sensed this, even then. A quiet feeling that something essential was being missed. A sense of distance that couldn't be explained by busyness alone. I noticed it late at night, or during rare pauses when there was nothing immediate demanding my attention. I usually dismissed it. I told myself everyone feels this way sometimes. What I didn't understand was that these small signals were invitations, not to overhaul my life, but to show up differently within it. To speak sooner, to listen longer, to let go of the idea that everything had to be resolved before I could be present. I also misunderstood sacrifice. I thought sacrifice meant endurance, pushing through, setting aside personal needs for the sake of duty. What I learned too late is that some sacrifices don't build anything. They simply hollow things out slowly until you're left with something that looks intact but feels thin. The painful clarity came when I saw how little of what I worked for actually accompanied me into this stage of life. The titles, the schedules, the careful planning, none of them sat with me in quiet moments. None of them filled the absence left by conversations not had and connections not deepened. What remained were people and memories, and where those were thin, the emptiness was unmistakable. I don't feel angry about this realization, just clear. Clear in a way that doesn't ask for debate. I can see now how often I treated what mattered most as optional, something I could come back to once everything else was handled. Everything else was never finished. That is what I understand now. You might be telling yourself you're doing what needs to be done. That responsibilities come first. That wanting more presence, more honesty, more connection is unrealistic right now. You might even feel slightly uncomfortable hearing this and reassure yourself that your situation is different, that you still have plenty of time. I used to think that too. Time feels abundant when nothing has forced you to measure it yet. When the losses are theoretical, when the people you love are still reachable, when tomorrow still feels like a given, you don't notice how often you trade moments for convenience because it seems temporary. You believe you'll circle back. What I want you to understand is that life doesn't announce when something is becoming final. There is no clear line between postponing and missing out. One quietly turns into the other, while you're busy being reasonable. I don't say this to scare you. Fear doesn't last. I say it because I recognize the pattern, the way you convince yourself that later will be different, the way you assume you'll feel more ready in the future than you do now. Readier to speak, readier to change, readier to choose differently. You won't suddenly become braver with time. You become more practiced at delay, more comfortable with routine, more invested in keeping things as they are. What feels temporary hardens into permanence without asking your permission. For me, there is no pretending anymore. I can see clearly where I waited when I should have acted, where I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I live with that clarity now. You still live with possibility. I won't tell you to fix your life. I won't tell you to take risks or chase fulfillment. I'll only say this. Pay attention to what you keep postponing. Not the big goals, the quiet things, the conversations, the presence, the moments you assume will always be available. Because one day, without warning, you will realize some of them aren't. And by then, knowing this won't change anything.